That's one question.
Sorry.
Okay. I'll address one question that I'm asked frequently in terms of why I did the book. It's Scandalous Women of the Old West, Women Who Dared to Be Different. I know a lot of people in this group will certainly appreciate that women who stepped outside the role of wife and mother were often considered scandalous in the old days. They were often ostracized by both men and women. Sometimes the women were a little more vicious about it than the men were. My love is research, and I've researched about 150 women of the Old West. And I was just sort of saddened to see that so few of them were well known by people that I knew. And I just felt that they had lived interesting lives and deserved a little more recognition. So this is my modest attempt to do that. I'm getting feedback. Are the rest of you? I'm getting an audio feedback. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. The first woman I'll speak of very briefly, all of the 10 I'm going to do very briefly, and then we have time for questions and answers. Doña Tules, I'm sure will be well known to all of you. A couple of things that I found so extraordinary about her was that she was such a phenomenal businesswoman. She managed to accumulate a great deal of land and property in terms of goods, mules, burros that she traded across the trails. Her gambling casino was known throughout the country and into Mexico, but she was very politically astute. She was not only good friends, and you can interpret that in a number of ways, with the governor when the Mexicans were still in power in New Mexico, but also when the American forces came in the very first night. She invited them to a gala dinner, and she worked very closely with them. She is probably, so far as I can determine, the only individual in the United States, man or woman, who ever made a personal loan to the US government to mount a military campaign. She was asked for $1,000, which she did eventually loan for a military expedition into Mexico for negotiations with the Mexican government. Another thing that I thought was so interesting, in her later life, she did become ill. My guess, and that's all it is that it might have been cancer. She was a very heavy smoker. I think she knew that her time was coming. She did the first will that was done in English. I think it was the second will done by a woman, but I can't swear to that fact. But she wanted a grand funeral and burial. And Bishop Lamy was newly arrived in New Mexico. He needed money for the cathedral. And she literally made a deal with him. And the church directly got about $1,000 plus a number of expenses almost equaling that for several priests to be in her funeral procession that wound through New Mexico. She arranged to be buried in the original church. The cathedral that you see here, this photo was taken not long after her death. The cathedral, of course, was built around that original church, and her burial site, it's not quite sure what was done with it. But I found her a very interesting lady, and her death was covered in newspapers from New York to San Francisco, and of course into Mexico itself. Another chapter deals with Mary Fields. A lot of people have heard of her as Stagecoach Mary. She has, her character has appeared in a number of movies, and she's been frequently mentioned in books. A lot of the information that I have seen is frankly wrong. She was born into slavery. When slavery was abolished, as was a frequent custom, she traveled with the daughter of the family that had previously owned her out to Denver. When the woman died, Mary was tasked with taking her children to Cleveland to a church school, a Catholic church school. She remained there as an employee, and she did a number of tasks for them, everything from landscaping to cooking to hauling supplies back and forth, and she became good friends with the Mother Superior. The Mother Superior was transferred to Montana to open a girls' school, primarily for girls, but settler girls also appeared there. Mary joined her shortly thereafter and again worked for the school. Mary was a very big woman, over 6 foot, and built very, very stocky. Unfortunately, Mary liked to drink. She was frequently in the saloons and she got into a lot of fights, some of them gunfights. She seemed to almost always win, but the bishop decided that she really was a bad influence on the girls, and he insisted that she leave the school. The Mother Superior helped her get a job as a postal carrier. Mary was the second woman postal carrier in the United States, certainly the first Black woman, and she is believed to be the first Black woman in Montana Territory. There had been Buffalo Soldiers there, the Black soldiers previously, but she was probably the first woman known. She was dearly beloved in the community, and to this day they have an annual Mary Fields celebration, and lots of good memories about her. Gary Cooper knew her when he was a child and actually did a couple of newspaper articles about her. But she almost never rode the stage. She used a buckboard most of the time. This is a picture of her in her traditional buckboard, and she covered a huge swath of Montana, summer and winter, and I can only imagine the trials she must have had. One chapter deals with 2 women. The 2 wives, this is Augusta Tabor. She was the first wife of Horace Tabor. He was considered the Silver King of Colorado, in fact, of the United States. For over 20 years, she supported him while he looked for gold and silver throughout mostly the Colorado territories. She baked for the miners. She took in laundry. She opened a store. She was a postmistress. Horace seemed to chat with the miners, and he was something of a glad hander. He used supplies from her store to grubstake a couple of miners on the condition that if they hit it big, he would get a third of their mine. And that happened. They hit silver, turned out to be a huge silver lode. He eventually bought them out, went on to buy a number of other mines, became fabulously wealthy. Horace, seen here, was quite a politician. He was the lieutenant governor of Colorado, but he also liked the ladies, had a number of very public affairs, and then he met Elizabeth Doe. Many, many books have been written about Elizabeth. Today she's often called Baby Doe. She was usually Lizzie back in those days. Apparently he truly fell in love with Elizabeth, and he asked Augusta for a divorce. She refused. He moved Elizabeth into the Brown Hotel in Denver very publicly, had his affair going with her. Augusta continued to refuse to give the divorce. Lizzie gave him an ultimatum that either he was going to be with her or she was going to be gone. He took her to Durango, where he apparently bribed a judge, had an illegal marriage. They were living together openly. Finally, the divorce proceedings came to court. It was very scandalous. It was covered in all the newspapers in New York and Miami and Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. There were lots of charges back and forth. A lot of the details came out about his bigamy with Lizzie. Eventually, Augusta did agree to the divorce, but his political career was pretty much ruined because of the scandals. As sort of a gesture, the Colorado senator had been appointed to the new cabinet, and so they agreed to send Horace to Washington, D.C. for the remaining 2 months of that term. He took Elizabeth with him, had a very, very lavish wedding in Washington, D.C. The president attended, all the cabinet attended, most of the senators and congressmen, but not one single woman. No wives would attend. Lizzie was blamed for the affair, and she carried that blame and that shame for the rest of her life. The women of Denver, they returned after the 2 months. The women of Denver would never receive her and would never associate with her. They had 2 daughters. One of the daughters' christening was covered on the front cover of Harper's Bazaar with a huge insert inside. Unfortunately, the silver strike hit, the bottom fell out of the silver market. Horace had not been an astute businessman. He lost everything. The banks collapsed, so he lost all of the cash he had. Their home, their mansion was repossessed. They moved into rented rooms. Horace died soon after. No one would come to Elizabeth's aid. She had 2 young daughters, but Denver turned its back on her. They gave him a very glorious funeral, but they turned their back on her. She and the girls returned to Leadville. She got no money from the settlement of his estate. And she eventually moved into a shack on the original mine, the Matchless Mine. And she lived there for almost 30 years. This is a photo that was taken shortly before her death. It's the last known photo. The story of Lizzie was, of all of those 150 women, probably the most tragic. She was treated, in my opinion, so unfairly. And Horace was accepted right back into society, but she was totally ostracized. Another chapter deals with Lozen. The information about Lozen is much more sketchy than about most of them. It came from other Apache warriors who had converted to Christianity and told her story to Anglos. She was considered a war shaman in the Apache tribe. It was believed that she could go up on the top of a hill with her arms outstretched, turn, and when she stopped, her arms would be pointing in the direction that the enemy was coming. In that case, it was either the Mexican army or the US Army. She was the sister of Victorio, famous war chief. She is the only known single woman to travel with the raiding tribes. There were some married women who traveled with them, but she was the only known single woman. After Victorio was killed, she rode with Nana, who is here in the center, on the famous 6-week raid through New Mexico that involved so much robbing and killing and burning. They eventually then hooked up with Geronimo and were with Geronimo when he finally surrendered after many purported surrenders, but he finally did. She was sent with the group and to Florida, and then eventually to Alabama. It is believed that she died there of tuberculosis. A lot of people have thought that the book is about prostitutes and madams, and I put in one just for fun because I was so impressed with Mattie Silks and her business abilities. It is estimated that Mattie earned well over $1 million during her lifetime. Mattie had several parlor houses in Denver. There are 3 levels of prostitution houses: the cribs at the lower level, brothels, and then the parlor houses. Mattie was very specific. She only had the parlor houses. They were usually, the establishments were much better decorated. The girls, excuse the term, but the girls were of a much better quality, much more attractive. Mattie supposedly treated her girls much better than most of the madams. Unfortunately, Mattie had one very serious weakness, and that was her husband, Court Thompson. He was a drunkard. He gambled seriously. He had many, many, many very public affairs, and he beat Mattie. Apparently that abuse was quite significant because it made it into the Denver papers, and that was most unusual for a woman of her profession. Usually, unless a madam killed someone, it never made the papers, but the beatings did. He was quite notorious in that way. There was a brief period where, when the gold had been discovered up in Alaska, Mattie and Court went up there, and she opened a parlor house that was very successful for one summer, but they did not like the cold. This is a picture not of Mattie's girls, and again, I use that word very carefully, but of a similar, was a strip of bordellos, but it gives you some sense of the conditions at that time. Susan McSween Barber, who during her lifetime was considered the cattle queen of New Mexico, had been one of the prominent survivors of the Lincoln County War. She was married to Alexander McSween, a lawyer, who was in partnership with John Tunstall, the Englishman who had come down to Lincoln. They opened a store, and they were in direct conflict with the Murphy-Dolan gang. There's a very long, convoluted explanation of why there was an attachment against Alexander McSween's property, which the local sheriff, who was a friend of Murphy-Dolan, decided to apply also to John Tunstall. John Tunstall was killed by a posse while he was taking some some horses into Lincoln. And that was the beginning of the Lincoln County War. Billy the Kid worked as a cowboy on Tunstall's ranch. And he and a number of the other ranch hands formed a group which would later become known as the Regulators. The entire Billy the Kid fame, or infamy, came out of this issue. Billy the Kid, Susan McSween, Alexander, her husband, her sister, and some children were all holed up in the McSween home in Lincoln. And a gun battle began between the Murphy-Dolan gang and the men in the house. The military came in and put some soldiers between the groups so that the McSween group was unprotected. Eventually, they allowed Susan to leave the house with her sister and the children. McSween went out to try to negotiate. He was gunned down and killed. And Susan blamed the military for the death of her husband. She brought a number of lawsuits against the general who was in charge. She managed to bankrupt him with the lawsuits, but he was never found guilty. However, he was demoted, and she had some satisfaction in that regard. She later, excuse me, I went too quick. She later remarried. She and her husband opened a ranch. She divorced him shortly thereafter, but she did own a number of ranches in New Mexico and ran several thousand head of cattle. She was a very colorful gal and lived a very interesting life. Another chapter deals with a Chinese woman called Polly Bemis. Polly was born in China. Her family sold her into slavery when she was a young teenager. She was sent by ship to San Francisco, where she was purchased by a saloon owner in Idaho. She was taken across the mountains into Idaho by pack train and became his concubine. A woman expected to do wifely duties without being the wife. One day, Big Jim, which was his name, the Chinese saloon owner, just dropped dead. And so Polly was free, but she was a lone woman in a mining town. There was another miner, Charlie Bemis, who sort of took her under his wing, and he built her a small house. It appeared to be a platonic relationship. She took in boarders and laundry. She cooked to support herself. This went on for a few years, and Charlie was shot. The doctors left him for dead. They said there was nothing they could do for him. She had learned herbal medicine in China, and she treated him and was credited with saving his life. At that time, many of the Chinese were being deported back to China, and Charlie married her in order to help her stay in the country. They moved to a very remote canyon on the Salmon River. And from that point on, Polly pretty much took care of Charlie. She had huge gardens. She hunted, she fished. The Salmon River began being used as a tourist river. They would raft down the river, and the rafters would apparently always stop at Polly's place, and it became known as Polly's place. She would feed them. They would spend a day or two. She apparently had a wicked sense of humor, and was very, very well regarded in the area. She used her herbal medications on all of the surrounding settlers. And when Polly died, at a time when the Chinese were being treated almost as subhumans, the all-male Chamber of Commerce served as her pallbearers. The newspapers had picked up the story of Polly, this former Chinese slave girl, and her death was recorded throughout the country. Most of the stories were a little on the salacious side, but she did get a tremendous amount of notoriety in her death. Elsie Clews Parson, I added sort of for fun, because I found the way she moved between her life in the West and her life in the East very interesting. Elsie was born to a very wealthy family, got her Ph.D. She married a very wealthy man. He was a congressman for many years. Her children played with the Roosevelt children in the Washington White House. Early on, she was quite a forward thinker. She dealt mostly in sociology in the beginning, and she wrote a number of books. She believed in open marriage. She believed that men and women a husband and wife did not need to necessarily socialize together. She had some really interesting progressive ideas. Her husband had to suffer through her notoriety every time he ran for election. But later in life, she got into anthropology. She became very interested in the social norms of the Native Americans in the West. She spent a great deal of time here in New Mexico, also Arizona, but here in New Mexico. And the books that she wrote about the social conditions, especially for women, but in general, are considered bedrock classics today. She was adopted into the Hopi Tribe. She took the practice of the long Indian skirts and moccasins back to Washington, D.C. She frequently attended parties at the White House in moccasins and long Indian skirts. I found her just a very interesting woman. This was one of her 3 homes. And she moved readily back and forth between those worlds for many years. Another chapter deals with Olga Schaff Little. From the age of a teenager, she began taking mule pack trains up into the mountains of Colorado to service the supply needs of the mines. Few men who had the pack trains would do it in the worst of the winter, but Olga did it year round. She took supplies up, food, equipment, stoves, shovels, whatever the mines might need. She would often bring back gold and silver on her mules, and the train actually ran a spur directly to her home so that she could offload the ore and have it shipped to the smelter. She occasionally would bring bodies back. A miner had died. It was a very interesting, long-lived career, and she was very well known in mining circles. Her biggest claim to fame in terms of notoriety came when one winter she was taking equipment, not food, but equipment up to a mine. She arrived in a blinding snowstorm, and the men had no food. They had been out of food for a couple of days already, and the storm was very, very serious. She waited with them for a couple of days, but the men were getting in very serious straits. She knew there was another mine close by, not close in today's terms, but that did have supplies. And she told the men that if they would trust her, she would put them, one man between her burros, holding on to the tail of the burros. And for 16 hours, she led those men through the storm to the other mine and was credited with saving their lives. Late in her life, she was surprised. The program, the TV program, This Is Your Life, they came to Denver and they brought back those men that she had saved. And they all surprised her and told the story of how she had saved their lives. Several of them lost fingers and toes to frostbite, but she got them through. This is just a picture of her leaving from her cabin and starting out on one of her pack trains. The last paragraph deals with Nellie Cashman. She was called the Angel of the Mines. Nellie had come to the US from Ireland as a young girl. She and her family, her mother and her sister, had traveled around the Cape over to San Francisco. She knew early on that she was not interested in being somebody's wife and waiting on them. She and her mother went off to Nevada, where they ran a boarding house at a mining camp, and Nellie fell in love with mining. I think that I can safely say that Nellie would go on to own more businesses than any other woman in the West, maybe more than any man. She owned boarding houses, she owned hotels, she owned restaurants, she owned shoe stores, she owned general stores. Everywhere she went, and it was always because of mining claims, she would open a store of some kind, open a business of some kind, and those businesses supported her mining. Nellie owned many, many, many claims throughout her life. She first became known nationally. She was up in Canada, had been in the Cashier area mining, and she, like most of the miners, had come out to Vancouver for the winter. That was the tradition at that time because the winters were so bad. They had barely gotten there when word came that there was a group of miners that had been caught and were snowbound, and they didn't have enough food to last through the winter. The military sent out an expedition to try to reach them. They turned back. They couldn't get through the snow. Nellie hired 6 men, and she bought the food, and they set out on a trek, and they trekked for 70 days to get through to the men. She was credited with saving their lives. They were already beginning to suffer from scurvy. And thereafter, the miners decided that Nellie was good luck, and they always welcomed Nellie into the various camps wherever she would go. Nellie traveled in a way that I can't even conceive of. It would be tough today, but in those days it seems almost impossible. She did mining treks down to Baja California, all over the Southwest. She went to South Africa looking for diamonds. She just traveled more than can be imagined. Later in life, when she was in her 50s, Nellie headed for Canada in a very serious way. This is the Chilkoot Pass. It was legendary because it was so very, very difficult. Because of the incline, you couldn't use your dogs to pull your sled. The Canadian Mounties required that everyone take 900 pounds of supplies and equipment in order to be able to survive on the other side. Many men, it took over a month. Nellie did it in 2 weeks. There are many written reports of men who encountered her on the other side, and they tell great stories of how well she was doing. She was traveling alone. She did it by herself. She remained in various areas of Canada for several years, and she eventually moved 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle, up into the Chilkoot River area. She had 11 mining camps there, mining claims, excuse me. This is a cabin that, as described, is very similar to one she lived in. Most winters, she traveled back to Arizona, where she had some family. That's 4,000 miles each way. She would musk out by dog sled to the coast, take a steamer south, come into San Francisco, then stagecoach or horseback, eventually trains back to Tucson. And she did that almost every year. Nellie had been quite a philanthropist in her life, and she was very staunch Catholic. And she would go around to the miners, and she gave and raised money to build many hospitals and churches, Catholic churches. On her last trek back to Alaska, she fell ill with pneumonia. Eventually, she had to be brought south, and she went to Victoria, and she spent her last days in Victoria in a church that she had raised the money to build almost 40 years before. That's a very brief overview of the book. Are there any questions?
Hang on 1 second, if you just let me